everybody, it's Eugene Lisho here, and welcome to episode 22 of Forensics Talks. Yes, 22. I never thought I'd get here, but we are definitely here. Just a few announcements before we begin. First off, I want to say thank you to all the people who are on the photogrammetry class this week. It was a heck of a lot of fun. It was great to see a whole bunch of different models being made and stuff, and you all have one more assignment you got to do, so I'm looking forward to seeing all of that come through. Also, keep in mind that those of you that were on the class are going to be able to get access to the Cloud Compare course. So I haven't actually announced it officially on my website or anything like that, but I will be doing that. So if you go to just ai2-3d.com, that will definitely be there. And let me just share this here. And also, so you'll see an ad, something like that. So it's going to be March 9th and 10th from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. So those 2 dates. So please keep that in mind. Also, upcoming, the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction Conference is coming up. So keep that in mind. That is going to be on the 2nd to 4th of March. And if you're interested in that, just go ahead. You can go to acsr.org and sign up and register. There's going to be a bunch of different presentations in a number of different areas. I believe this week is the Academy, American Academy of Forensic Science Conference. That's ongoing. So I know some people that are on that as well. Okay, on that note, let me just take care of a few things here, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So Alice White, she is a biology major, or at least that's where she studied originally, from the University of Alaska in Anchorage. And from 1997 to 2001, she was a latent print examiner for the State of Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory. From 2001 to 2002, she was a crime scene analyst at Henderson Police Department. And from September 2002 to 2006, a latent print examiner for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. From 2006 to 2018, she was the forensic lab manager for latent prints, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and currently she's the owner of Evolve Forensics, and she's been doing that, I think, officially since about 2014. Now, Alice is she's an absolute pillar in the latent print discipline or area. She participates in scientific working group on friction ridge analysis, expert working group on human factors and latent print analysis, OSAC committees, editorial review board for the Journal of Forensic Identification, and a number of organizations, including being a distinguished member of the International Association for Identification. She's published a whole bunch of articles and chapters, some of which I'll make sure to post or drop the links into here, because she has a ton of excellent information. She's lectured at conferences throughout the world and about a whole bunch of different areas, like analysis of distortion in latent prints, difficult latent print decisions, essentials of latent print examination, and palm prints. And so on that note, I'm going to bring her in here.
Hello.
Hello. How are you, Alice?
Oh boy, see, the dog's already started. Usually they're nice and quiet. We're off to a rough start.
I must have said your name or something, and they just said, "Hey, she's on. Now's the time."
Yeah.
Okay.
They heard me get animated. They're like, "What's happening?"
Yeah, no kidding. Well, let's start at the beginning. Why don't we? Let me start off. You studied biology, and so I don't know if that tells me something about you or not, but what got you into that area? Was it something just you were always interested in? There's even a turtle on your as part of your logo, so that means something. That means you either a nature lover or a biology lover.
Well, it probably has to do with where I grew up. So I grew up in, we'll call it upstate Maryland. So northern Maryland, close to the Pennsylvania line. And in that part of the country, I grew up in the woods. So we owned 2.5 acres. There was an old cabin that had no like running water or electricity on it when my dad bought the property in the late 60s. And he actually built the house that I grew up in. And so I grew up in 2.5 acres that we owned, but I was surrounded literally by the 100-acre woods. So just like Winnie the Pooh. So I grew up very much a wild child of nature. So I was always like dirty and beat up and falling out of trees. And my mom was always like frustrated with me. And so I sort of kind of got to grow up in this very naturalistic environment. And so, we were surrounded by farms. I worked on farms as a kid. I helped take care of, racehorses, and just my friend's dad was actually a farmhand, and we would cut miles through the woods to the back of the property where the farm was, and just spend our day lollygagging around on the farm. So I would say I grew up very much in tune with the natural world, and I was very curious about it. So I think probably from the time I was about 6, I knew I would study biology. Like, there was no doubt whatsoever in my mind, and it would be focused at the time on animal biology. So going through school, I was one of those actually quite nerdy kids, and I was an honor student. I was taking all the advanced classes. I got through calculus in high school. I was in all the advanced chemistry classes. And so at the time, I couldn't afford to go very far for school. So I went to a state school in Maryland, but of course was a biology major. And then I just ran away. So I took off to Alaska, which actually, and just continued my degree program up there. And so I finished my degree at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, because you can't get more wild than living in Alaska. So,
yeah, that's true.
Just
That's
a different type of wild, basically. And so that's kind of where it's just always been in me. So science. Yeah. And my whole dad's family is that way. They're all like engineers and scientists and very analytically minded. My mom's side is more artistic. And so that didn't rub off at all on me. But I think I passed that on to my kids, luckily. But it skipped me.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I had a farm when we were kids. We lived in this sort of on the edge of the city, but we had about 30 acres that we farmed. And there was a big creek and stuff near me. So I have sort of the same kind of thing I can think of. That's where you spent your time. I mean, they weren't your similar age, so we weren't doing all the tablet stuff or whatever. So if you wanted to play, so yeah, I always make the joke that, I give my kids get in trouble now for staying in too much. Or being on their electronics too much, where before it was like you were always outside too much and they would call you in, but very different. So
you had to be within shouting radius at dark.
You know that one. You too. There you go.
And we didn't have cable. Like, I grew up without cable at all. So it's kind of funny because my husband and I were, obviously the same age, and he grew up in the city with cable. So he is the total MTV generation.
Right.
I didn't even see MTV until much later on. And I never had cable in a place where I lived until I was well into adulthood.
Yeah. So tell me about the transition then into the forensics area then.
Well, it was really accidental. So that's the kind of funny thing, because in the mid to late 90s, forensics wasn't a thing. Like, you had all the TV shows centered on like detectives, and had like Matlock and stuff like that. But the idea of working in forensic science really wasn't a thing. And the reality for me at that time is that by the time I was graduating college, so I graduated high school when I was 17. So I graduated college when I was 21, with my Bachelor of Science in biology. But I had a 2-year-old by then. So when I graduated college, I was working crazy jobs and going to school full time, and I just needed to work because I had myself and my daughter to care for. And so as a very young, at that time, I was actually married very young and then already got divorced. I was struggling just to find anything in a science related field that would pay the bills, basically. And so I was actually doing really crappy jobs for a while. In evenings, I was working 2 jobs. I was trying to just make ends meet. And at the time, I was just applying to any lab environment that would somehow use my background in science. And so I had applied actually at the state crime lab initially for an evidence custodian position, so working in the evidence room. And at the time, though, it just wasn't the right time. But the lab director that I interviewed with was like, I think you'd actually be a really good fit here, but just not this job. So he had asked and let me know that another job would open up soon in the latent print section as a trainee. And for those of you who know Leslie Hammer, It was actually her replacement position because she had transferred to drug chemistry at the time. So I was actually going to be replacing her in the forensic lab in the latent print section. But at the time, I didn't even know what the term latent print meant. I literally had no background, no anything about forensics. So it was really kind of funny because I just interviewed for another job at an environmental engineering company, and I was the number 2 person on their list. And it was actually a much higher paying job than the state crime lab position. And I remember when I interviewed for the latent print position, I got the call back, but I'd already been offered as second on the list for the other job for more money. I'd also got offered that job. And what's kind of funny is after I applied for the job in latents at the state crime lab, I had actually written a poem to the lab director at the time, really kind of tongue in cheek, because during the interview, he'd actually asked me if I'd be willing to clean toilets. So I wrote this like really funny poem to him and the chemistry supervisor at the time, Chris Everett, to just as a thank you for taking the interview and, you know, whatever. And it was this really kind of silly poem, and he saved it for all those years. So it was still floating around somewhere, and it actually resurfaced when I left. And then he called me to offer the job, and I was still deciding on the first one. And I remember he called me, and I was like, he offered me, he's like, oh, you know, this is George Taft with the State of Alaska Crime Laboratory. We're calling here to offer you the position in latent prints. And I literally didn't even know how to react. I was like 24 years old. I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And then I had 2 job offers now. So I went from, you know, really sad jobs that I was working at the time to having now 2 full-time offers, one of which actually paid more, but in the environmental company, they were dependent on contracts in the oil companies. And I'd already done that, and I knew how touchy those were. So I was like, well, I'll go with the government job.
Right. Hey, why not?
Literally how I ended up in latent prints. And I had to, before the interview, I was looking online, trying to figure out what a latent print was. So I remember that and reading about like ninhydrin and super glue. So I sounded really smart in the interview.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Great. So from there, I mean, you got some experience, you got to work on cases and things like that. When did you sort of, because I mean, you know, you're sort of doing the regular job, latent prints, whatever, but when did you start going, hey man, there's like more to this here than meets the eye? I don't know if it's like this for you, but for me, when I got started, I thought, like, I mean, maybe this was the case when you first got the job, you know, they know it all. They've been doing this forever, right? Like there's nothing left to be done. It's like, you know, I'm on the receiving end, but then you sit there and sometimes you're listening to people going, you know, explaining something. You're like, they didn't do that yet. Like, don't they know this or don't they know that? So I don't know if you had that moment, like where you're like, there's like a big rabbit hole here that I'm going to go down. But when did that first happen with you?
I see what you did there. Rabbit hole. Alice. Got it. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I found lots of rabbit holes.
Yeah.
And actually it was for me, and I'm sure it might've been the same for you. So when I came into the discipline, it was 1997. And this was right before the first big Daubert hearing in fingerprints. And that's a federal evidentiary hearing that took place in I think it's 3rd District in Pennsylvania that was upcoming. So when I came into forensics, accreditation standards had just been beginning. And there was still a lot of debate in the community about different aspects of fingerprints. And we were starting to see these Daubert challenges. And actually, I think by the time I started, it was right around that time that the first Daubert hearings in forensics were actually coming up, and they were batting most of them down. But question documents had got hit with some of it. And so I remember everyone kind of watching question documents, like what's happening over there, and do we need to worry about it? So it sort of became like this very transitional time where there was just a lot of upheaval. So I had the fortune of sort of starting during this time of kind of upheaval, and people were starting to question things and wonder, you know, like, what did we really know about ourselves as examiners and as a science? So, and I realized, and I was fortunate enough to be sent to training very early in my career out of Alaska, right? So I got to meet all these other working professionals, And then I realized how amazing my training program was compared to other people. And, and I also realized that access to an instructor who I spent like 2 weeks, I took 2 back-to-back classes with Pat Wertheim. And he was on the foreground of a lot of the stuff that was going on at the time. And so that sort of opened my eyes really quickly to the lay of the land, basically, and where the rabbit holes were sitting that I might want to wander down. So it was just sort of a lucky break at the time that I started and being introduced and sent to training, really, to meet some of the leaders in our field that were starting to ask questions.
Right.
And it was a time when we were kind of questioning the way things had always been done. So, so it was just sort of, and I love that environment. I love like, why do I know that? And why do I think that? And where did that come from? And who said it? And where did they get it? Like I started to go, like the impetulant child who's always like, but why? Why?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so it kind of started early on. And then I actually had my first publication was in 1999. And it was just a processing thing. Like I didn't know how to process a particular piece of evidence. And I didn't know what to expect. I couldn't find anything in the literature. So I contacted, Pat Wertheim, because I thought, well, he seems to know everything. And I was like, have you ever heard of anything about this? And he said, no. Why don't you do some research and you should try to get published? And he goes, and actually, his son at the time was working in fingerprints. He said, Casey's working on a similar case with different types of evidence, but maybe you two should work together. So that was actually mine and Casey's first publication back in 1999. Yeah. So then I was like, oh, if I can do this, this will work. This is kind of fun.
Yeah. Now, did Pat work on, I'm trying to think, because he's worked on some big cases too, right?
Yes.
Like in fingerprint. I don't know if did he work on like any like
Jackson Pollock?
Jackson Pollock. Yeah. The art forgery.
Van Dam case, the little girl, just lost her first name, the Van Dam case in California. And the Shirley, is it McKee or Mackay? I never know.
McKee or Mackay. I'm not sure how he's pronounced.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I really feel.
So he worked on that one too.
Yeah. He was over in Scotland for actually quite some time. Him and Dave Grieve were both over there. Dave Grieve is in Illinois. And so, so Pat Wertheim, Dave Grieve, David Ashball from Canada, and Ron Smith out of Mississippi were my early instructors. And so I kind of got the benefit of having these interactions with people who at the time were at the forefront of, keeping everybody together as all these changes were taking place in our discipline.
Okay. Well, so I first found out about you in speaking with Brian Yamashita when he was around with the RCMP. He's since retired. But when I do a lot of 3D work and that sort of thing. And so I was really interested in 3D fingerprints, and there was actually a company that I was speaking to a while back, and they had like a finger scanner, not so much fingerprint. And then I'll show you this, like you do this right, and you can develop like 3D prints. And I was interested in a few things, like for example, teaching tools and that sort of thing. But I was really interested in what happens with the finger when you pressure, turning, twisting, or whatever. So Brian's like, you got Alice. She's the one. Like she's the queen. She's the queen of distortion, right? So
my skin flicks are famous.
Right. So when did you first start? Well, I know a story because we haven't spoken a lot, but yesterday we had a brief conversation, and you had an interesting story about the trip to Holland. All right, your first. Was that your first training? That was your first training gig.
So there's so many stories. I don't even know where to begin. So my very first class. Yeah. So we talked yesterday about how I got started in teaching. Thanks, Jack. I just saw the comment pop up there. So essentially what happened, I'll kind of get to the beginning. I'll give you the origin story of how I ended up filming fingers. I was teaching quite a bit at conferences and it was mostly the biology. So first and foremost, I was most known for teaching the biological aspects of the skin. So understanding the embryological formation of the skin, and I still teach that quite a bit. And also the morphology and physiology. So like what happens when skin ages and, like how does it maintain itself? So kind of breaking down the scientific aspects or the biological aspects of the discriminating power of fingerprints, and also for the persistency of the skin. And as a natural consequence of some of my interactions with my trainers early on, like Pat Wertheim, he was about to switch jobs and take a full-time position, and he didn't want to teach anymore. And he had this class called Analysis of Complex Latents. And he's like, Alice, I think you can take this over. I think you could teach this. And I was like, but Pat, like at the time, I was like, I've only been doing this like 3 or 4 years. And he had been doing it like 30 some years. And I was like, well, you can send me your materials. I'll kind of take a look at it. And when I looked at it, I still have the original notebook he sent me with the original 4x5 film enlargements in it.
Yeah.
And I looked at these images and I thought to myself, well, like I can see the ID, like I can see that there's a lot of garbage in the print, and I can see what detail agrees, and I can, look at the comparison. I was like, but as far as explaining what all that garbage is, I was like, who am I? Like, I don't know. I mean, I could give you an educated, well, not even an educated guess. I could give you an explanation for it that I've basically don't really have any basis for. And then I realized, as I looked at the materials, I realized I didn't have any basis. So I was like, what are we telling people? Because where did my knowledge about the garbage and the schmutz that we see in a latent print, where did my knowledge base actually come from?
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized it wasn't any sort of systematic study. Like, I went back to some of the textbooks in fingerprints at the time. So remember, this is like early 90s or late 90s. And I found like a sentence that said fingerprints can be distorted in one book. And I found like 2 sentences in another book that basically said fingerprints can be distorted. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
And I realized this was like this gaping hole in my knowledge base. So I was like, well, first I kind of sat in the corner in fetal position and rocked back and forth for a few days. I had that similar actually feeling recently when I was coming back when quarantine started, and my business was collapsing, but recovered.
Yes.
So I was like, there has to be a way to deal with this. So I grabbed our family video camera. So literally it still had film in it. Like, this was before digital video cameras were a thing. And it just so happened that literally my coffee table in my family room had a nice thick glass on it that actually filmed through beautifully. And I just started taking videos of the skin. So my first thought was, well, I understand how the skin is formed and I understand how the skin maintains itself, but I literally have no idea how skin behaves when it makes contact with a surface. So then I upgraded my camera at the time. I bought what I could afford, and it was like the first iteration of digital cameras, like the very first ones. But actually, I still use those videos today. They actually were quite good. So I just started filming, and I had this huge spreadsheet with all these different ways to move the skin. I'm like, light pressure, 1 millimeter to the left, medium pressure, 1 millimeter to the left. And then I had like high, medium, low, up, down, left, right, diagonals, twist, combinations of twist and drag, and like all these kind of things. So I had this like massive spreadsheet of doom. And it took me a couple years of just sort of working on the weekends. Sometimes we had beer while we did it. And just collecting them, just really for my own personal sort of curiosity about like, well, what does the skin do? And then as that was beginning to gel in my mind, I would show people, I go to meetings and I'll be like, I have some skin flicks I want to show you. And they were like, okay, Alice. And I was showing these videos. I showed David Ashball. And so him and I had long conversations. I have pictures. I actually have a picture someone took of us. We were doing a vision science research project with Tom Busey at Indiana University. And I have a snapshot someone took of him and I looking at my computer screen, my laptop. And that was literally the moment that I was showing him like all these videos that I was taking.
Oh my goodness. So I have to ask you, so then, you're talking about, you've been spending all this time looking at these videos. So what, if I may ask, what struck you, or what gelled, or what started to form in your mind? What did you notice that was like, wow, hey, there's something here?
That everything I'd been told was wrong. I was like, no. Actually, a couple things were right, but there was a lot that was wrong. And I realized everything has to do with how the structure of the finger is. Like you have the bone structure and you have this fat tissue underneath, and all the squishiness in your finger, that's all fat tissue. So the fat tissue is compartmentalized differently. Different parts of the finger are more flexible than other parts of the finger. And then the contact area, so the tops of the ridges that are actually contacting the surface, they push residue around. And guess what? Those ridges pushing residue around, that's where most of the garbage in your print comes from, because it's adding residue into spaces where you don't want it to be. And then that creates, difficulty visualizing what's ridge and what's furrow. Yeah. And so I was just like astounded of how little any of us really knew about the distortion stuff. And so when I was, again, sharing my videos at conferences and meetings, Herman Bergman from, at the time he was in Holland, Dutch National Police, he was like, oh, this is like really interesting. And then he contacted me a bit later and he's like, so could you like package this stuff you're doing, like do something and we'll actually pay you to come over and teach us what you've figured out. And I was like,
sure, paid? Yeah.
like, seriously? Like, a paycheck for this? This is crazy. And it was like 2006. I just got promoted to manager, like life was crazy. My first notebooks were printed on with a inkjet printer, page by page, with like the 3 inkwells in it, like an Epson. Like it took me days of not sleeping to print these little notebooks that I put together for the class. I still have a copy of it. And then, and I hadn't written the lecture yet. So I literally didn't sleep for 4 days. Then I flew over to Holland and taught my first class, and I had to write the lecture the night before. So I took like a nap, and then I stood up. Of course, back then I was much younger. So I was up all night writing the lecture and then like walked right in to teach it. Oh, thanks, Terry. And then but then after day one, the next day's lecture didn't exist yet. So then I had to take a nap and then type all night long and get ready for that lecture. I have pictures of me actually teaching that first class. They're really cute. So it was just insanity. I didn't sleep for like a week. And then I came home, and I don't even remember the flight home. I just slept the whole way home.
Yeah. So you got to keep going, because there's a clock that comes up at the end of this. That's just kind of funny. The Barber.
Oh boy. Yeah. So I was so tired. And back then I hadn't quite learned. So, when you film the skin, everything's mirror image, right? Because when you look at a print, you look at it, you deposit it, and then look on the top, right? But when you're filming from underneath. And I hadn't yet realized that by doing that every time the image that we're looking at in the notebook, it slides to the right. In the video, it looks like it's sliding to the left. And I hadn't quite figured out that it would be hugely beneficial to flip all the images in the notebook. And it wasn't that left, right, like my brain, I was so tired. I was a train wreck cognitively. Cognitive load was on series overdrive. But I hadn't switched those around. And so what was killing me was clockwise and counterclockwise. And over there, it was anti-clockwise. So I was trying to use the clockwise, anti-clockwise. And I was so dyslexic it's bad enough in fingerprints when you switch the hands back and forth and you get the left hand confused with the right hand, the top record confused with the bottom record. I just could not get clockwise and counterclockwise. And then we were laughing about it, especially the whole second day, because I was just a mess. And so, so we go through this whole thing, and I'm trying to get clockwise, counterclockwise. So what I didn't know at the time, and this is sort of weird, this like weird backstory was going on that I wasn't aware of, is that the lead there, Ahri Retirement, was connected to the Shirley McKee case also. So him and Pat Wertheim. And he had heard about these videos. Herman had told him about these videos that I was doing. And so as I understand, Ahri, because of the type of distortion interpretation that had been used to explain and justify the identification of Shirley in that case, he was challenging that. And so he knew that I had a bunch of videos of the skin twisting and dragging and moving around on the surface. So really what this was about is Ahri wanted to see what I had. And I kind of didn't know really that's sort of what was a big push for it. So of course I'm over there, doing my thing, not really thinking about it. And so a few years later, he's involved in the inquiry that had to do with that case. So now fast forward, it's like another 4 years or so later. And he contacts me, he messages me and asked if I ever published results that I had come up with. So I did like just a basic summary, basically, of the more simplistic things that I'd done. And I said, yeah. I said, I published them earlier this year. And he's like, oh, okay. Can you send me the paper? Because I'm going to introduce it as evidence in the inquiry of the Crown and looking into this this records office. And I was like, oh, okay. So, so he had it actually introduced into the inquiry case, and part of my paper is actually quoted in the big document that they published. And so that was really overwhelming. So fast forward another year or so, a couple years after that, I was invited to give a talk in Latvia. So, it was a European meeting. It might have been like one of the Interpol conferences. I can't quite remember now. I just remember Latvia. And so I get invited to, and it's the year that Ahri's retiring. So they kind of had like a big retirement thing. So it was the night of the big social event. And actually we didn't talk about this when we met earlier yesterday. They had, the event was down the river. So you had to walk over to get on these gondolas, and the gondolas, it was like several of them leaving, and they went across the river and dropped you off at the conference center. So everyone's lined up, and I'm at the back of the line. Cause of course I went back to my room and took a nap, and I was all not functioning properly again, as I am always in Europe. So I'm in the last gondola, right, to go over to the conference center. And they had held a table for all the speakers. So I'd given a lecture at the conference, and, all the organizers and the speakers were supposed to be together at one table. So I'm in the gondola, and it's not very many of us. So it's the last one. So it's got the least amount of people. And we're headed across the river, to get to the event. And all of a sudden, we're not moving. We got stuck on a sandbar.
You did? Well, that's
in
interesting.
the middle of a river. And we're like, why aren't we going anywhere? And the poor guy that was driving the boat was in pure panic. So we're literally stuck on a sandbar, stranded in the middle of this river. And I broke out into Celine Dion's Titanic song. Just cause we may have had some wine and champagne on the boat. And it was just a small, most of the people on there did not speak English other than me. But the minute I started singing that song, everybody knew, right? So we're just kind of laughing and carrying on. And I can't sing, by the way. So it was equally funny. And so we're just dying at this point. So then they had to send another gondola, and we had to disembark our gondola onto another one and then make our way to the conference center. And so by now I'm the last one. We're super fashionably late, and everyone at the tables, they've already had lots of wine. They're like, where have you been? And I'm you're not going to believe what just happened. So we get in there, and I get to the table, and then we actually sang, they put out the words to a Beatles song that were rewritten for Ari Zeelenberg, and we all sang to him. So it was actually really cool. And then he gave this little talk at the end, and he actually made me cry, because he was Alice, he recognized me in his retirement speech. He's basically, I hope I did right by you, the way he presented my stuff. And I was oh, and I was really overwhelmed by it all. And so I think it was the next day I was giving my talk at the conference, or I don't even remember what it was, what the schedule was. And I'm up finishing my talk, and I'm just exhausted. I don't think I slept all night long. I think we'd gone out to some club in some shot up building, and we're dancing and carrying on. So it was one of those nights. And so I'm totally, just surviving on coffee the next day, giving my talk, and the boot.
Yeah, the boot. You see what Terry's comment?
Oh yeah, Minnesota. Yeah. I remember Das Boot. Das Boot. I just got some German cookbooks. I'm very excited about that. Anyway, so I'm finishing up my talk, and and I'm just on autopilot trying to finish. And then here comes Ahri from the back of the room, and he's bringing me a gift. And I was like, oh no, what's this? And it was a clock that's a Barber clock. So it goes, everything is in reverse. To make fun of the fact that I could not get clockwise and counterclockwise down straight to save my life. Very first class from 2006. So I get this amazing clock, and it's, everything's backwards on it. And I almost turned into like a body cavity search at the airport because they were convinced that I was like bringing a bomb onto the plane or something. So I had to go through this like whole thing at the airport, trying to get back to the United States. But it hangs in my bathroom to this day. It's still there. It hangs in the bathroom. So when I'm in the mirror getting ready, it shows correctly the right time. So I've had that in my bathroom ever since.
That's great. Yeah. I think we're all going to be waiting. I keep telling people, I said, wait for the next conference when people can actually get together again. It's going to be wild. Like everybody's going to let loose. People will be crying and hugging each other. And like, I miss you so much. And,
yes.
Right.
They're writing articles that we're going to have this like episode that's like the 1920s all over again. Like there's just going to be like partying in the streets as everyone is sort of like, I'm out of my house. And of course, by then we'll be like, wow, it wasn't so kind to you being stuck in the house for 18 months. That's right. But no one will care. That's the beauty of it all.
That's true. That's absolutely true. So let me ask you a question about the changes that have occurred for fingerprint examiners over the years. And so if you can go back and look at your career or look at what's happened to the whole area of fingerprint examination from, early 2000s or so up until now, what are some of the biggest changes that have happened in that area?
So our world just got really big, really fast. And so I think between the, changes with accreditation, so especially here in the United States, the accreditation process really slowed things down, and not necessarily for bad, but definitely documentation standards, increased educational standards. And then as our world got really big, I think the size of databases and understanding just how similar two prints from different people could look, it sort of shocked the conscious when mistakes were happening. And a lot of them were attributed to these big database searches. So sort of what we discovered is that some of the things that were sort of these like core belief systems were predicated on a much smaller world and with much smaller communities in mind. And so the viewpoint that we shared wasn't necessarily prepared for the size of the world we were getting into. And we just didn't necessarily get into that very gracefully. And so as a result, we had to really think about how we talk about forensics, how we talk about what we know. So for instance, if you say everyone in the whole world has different fingerprints, even if that is theoretically true, you can't prove it, right? That's not a level of proof that can be met. And you can't even say that that's based on your experience if the largest subset of the world that you've ever looked at is, let's say, your national database. So you can't even say that from an experience perspective. What you can say is, I wouldn't expect to find another person in the United States that has a fingerprint that looks like this based on my experiences in a very large database that is representative of the US population. And that's kind of a different way of talking about it. And it's a harder way of talking about it because you sort of don't want to leave this little open door that says, well, it could have been someone in Austria that left this print then. Especially living in Las Vegas, where we have a very international, well, we did up until COVID, where we have a lot of people from all over the world coming into our city on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. So there was a lot of like, how do we talk about this, but not feel bad about ourselves? And talking about the fact that the examiner, so like we would say that, the reason fingerprints can be used is because they're persistent and they're unique, except that that's not the only thing. There's another thing, the person. Like you can't extract the examiner from that. You have to include the examiner in the process because fingerprints as a means of identification does not exist without a person to assess them and make those decisions. And we're not perfect. And so and then looking at, well, us not being perfect isn't because individual people necessarily are bad. It's just that we operate in these systems and environments that can either help us or hurt us. Right. And so looking at it from a human factors perspective and looking at the environment that we work in, the systems that we work in, and how those are helping or hurting us, how our philosophy of what we do might set us up for failure, how, attitudes.
Well, I give the fingerprint examiners some credit because they really have done a lot of work in this particular area, more so than in some other areas that I think now are starting to embark on a similar type of journey, like, for example, bloodstain pattern analysis. Even areas like shooting reconstruction, they need a ton of work, right? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that needs to be done. So some of the people like Glenn Langenberg, Christophe Champeau, like they did, and yourself, like and others have done a lot of good work. What about the types of technology equipment and also the methods, right? So you hear, and this is not my area, right? So, but you hear ACE-V, for example, like, is that just the same? Has that changed? What about the tools that are at your disposal now, or the, typical fingerprint examiner? What do they have today that maybe they didn't have 20 years ago?
Well, a lot of that is going to be like budgetary issues. So like in our lab, the latent print unit put out more casework than any other section. And we were also the cheapest section of the lab because at the end of the day, we can do a lot of things without any technology. And so there's, to some extent, just getting a decent LIMS system, laboratory information management system that doesn't make you want to rip your hair out is a challenge. Getting I came up in the age when digital imaging first started, and I would spend hours and hours of my day burning CDs and DVDs, before digital imaging technology was available to quickly upload, download, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that ultimately, you can still just send in a stack of lift cards and some inked prints from your victim, and we can still do our job. Like we don't need anything unless you have different types of questions that you want to answer. So I think the databases obviously are a huge change, but it still requires the examiner on the back end. I think so the statistical models have matured a lot, but they're still not widely used because many of them worked on fingers. So when you build and validate a statistical model on fingers, while it might be helpful if all you have are minutia, because the models are all built around minutia, what happens when the examiner has other stuff? Like what if there are some really cool creases or a scar or like other information in the print, how do you weigh that in? And then if everything is built around the structure of a finger, minutia distributions and fingers, it depends on where you are. So are they modeling the area where there's a high density of minutia, or are they modeling an area with a low density minutia? Because if you model high density, then it doesn't work well in low density. If you model low density, it doesn't necessarily work well in high density. And if you model the average, does it work okay in both? And then those distributions, once you get out of this little area of the finger, change through the rest of the hand and the feet. And so like in management, as a manager, I would be like, okay, fine. It was all developed and validated around fingers. But I can't have examiners reporting one type of evidence for a finger, but then have to come back and go old school because they have a palm print. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, and I think it's because friction ridge information is just so incredibly complicated. And so it's a good start, and we'll get there maybe at some point. And then you have to look at the error rates. What are the false positive and false negative error rates of that particular technology? Because to my knowledge, we're not finding that the error rates are better than examiners. So have you just replaced something that takes a lot more time because the examiners have to upload all those images, they have to plot all those minutia, when they could have just looked at it and given you the same answer. So I just think there's a lot of streamlining. Like we don't operate in an environment. Like I always tell people, I want like the Minority Report screen where I can pull in my latent and then pull in my known and turn things around and then throw it off to the side when I'm done and then pull in the next one. And, like if it was that seamless and I could just move things around and zoom in and rotate and zoom out, I'd be like, woo, this is great. Except I don't know of any department that wants to spend that kind of money. Yeah. So it's so clunky. Like everything is just so clunky right now when you're trying to, and that it is just so much easier to pick up the lift card with your magnifier and just turn it and look at the end of the day.
Yeah. What about, so is it safe to say that, at least in some of the reports that I've seen, the fingerprint examiners do really well. I mean, overall, they do quite well, right? And there are situations where, for example, when the quality of the evidence deteriorates, and you've got something that's like, this is not, then maybe is that the area where people start getting in trouble?
It's not just that. So, and
Mhm.
that's sort of the weird thing. Like a lot of times in these studies, you've kind of have one latent and then a set of one known, like even one finger of a known. But in cases, you have the context of the case, right? So you have lift cards from all over the exterior of this vehicle. You can kind of sense based on the way the skin is behaving that you kind of have like multiple donors, and you can kind of tell which impressions probably came from the same donor, even though the impressions are different because each finger obviously has a different fingerprint and each palm has its own. But the hands tend to mirror each other, like in the amount of creasiness. So if you start seeing creasy handprints, you know the creasy ones are probably from one person and the non-creasy ones are basically from someone else. So there's this sense that you get about the skin, especially in a case where you have multiple impressions. And you'll have different parts of even the finger recorded, but you can kind of get a sense that, you know, perhaps this is the same person. So what happens is in a case, you've got all these comparisons, and oftentimes there's numerous identifications to the same subject over and over and over and over. So the odds that that is all wrong, right? Because most of the erroneous identifications don't involve cases with lots of IDs.
Mhm.
So we have to look at what are the case parameters that might set us up for failure. And so if you have a case and you know, we have found that the large databases, right? So a lot of the errors are associated with large database searches. So if you have, and they're usually impressions that require a lot of interpretation through the distortion, where essentially when you look at that print, you might see things about 5 or 6 different ways. And they're all possible permutations of the configuration of features because it's got so much garbage in it. So when you have a print with a lot of stuff in it, sometimes you just can't tell which features are true and which features might be false. So you kind of have to leave some leeway for that interpretation. So if you take an impression, and let's say that's the only one you've got, and then you run it through a big database, and so you have a degraded impression where there's a lot of possible interpretations of the features, and then you run it in the database, and that person that you think you've hit on, and that's the only print that comes back to that person, that is the perfect storm. And so, I mean, if you run a really beautiful quality print and hit a person, what's the danger? Because there's not much interpretation there, especially if you have lots of information, or you only run one of the prints from the case and you identify that person 16 more times. Or like what would happen with us, we run prints in the big database and we are identifying people who live in the house, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, so there's a lot of like case context and reinforcement that comes through. And so people, I definitely understand the concerns for bias in those circumstances. But I think people often forget we are also exposed to a lot of debiasing information. So in other words, when we run a print in the big database, we get feedback because we often hit the victim. Like the victim's name is on the packet. The victim lives there. The car is registered to this person.
Sure.
So we get some feedback there. And we also get a lot of feedback because of all the cases we work where, especially in our jurisdiction, we would have 2 people listed to compare. We compare those 2 people and nothing belongs to them. And then we run it and hit 3 or 4 other people in the database and provide that information over. And then the detective's like, oh yeah, they're all part of the same crew. We knew they were there. That's why we didn't ask you to compare them. We were worried about these other people because we didn't have any evidence of them. Or, you know, like, oh yeah, that's, you know, so-and-so. They were like known associates of this person. So, or they're like, oh, I didn't know, you know, like, and that becomes the actual lead for the case. And so we get so much information that turns out not to be true because of the way the requests are submitted, and just, you know, the detectives aren't really sure. So they ask us to look at these people. And we end up coming up with other people. That there's a lot of that, like sort of like debiasing stuff happening every day. So it's not, you know, it's not as exciting, I think, as what people presume it to be.
Yeah.
But sometimes you do get those cases though. I mean, certainly they happen where you take a chance on one print in the case because there's not much there, and then you hit someone and they don't appear to be related to the victim, and then the question is this a crummy, what are the parameters for that particular case?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
That makes sense. Let me ask you about training. So, I mean, I've seen you do a ton of stuff in like many different areas in the whole latent print area. But what are your most popular? Is the distortion and palm print, like, are those your two big ones, or what, or management? The management, like, which ones are your most popular courses?
so right now, the distortion class, of course, that's been going on since 2006. So that's like always gangbusters. And for my webinars that I'm doing online right now, those are certainly some of the more popular ones. And so, yeah, so the distortion, that's just sort of been my bread and butter for forever. So that one, I still get requests to teach all over. Every year I'm like, at some point, people are going to be like, oh, we're tired of Alice. We don't want her anymore. Hi, Lucas. But that doesn't happen. So those classes still keep going strong. And then as I was training people at the department, and I realized how much the academic side of it. So this is really about interpretation. This is straight up, what do I see when I look at a print, and what are the causes? Like, why does it look like this and not like that?
Okay.
But then I realized people equally struggle to sort of defend the basis of what they do based on how good the skin is and how good fingerprint examiners are. And even just talking about like error rate studies, like what is a confidence interval? Like when the PCAST report came out in 2016, what did those numbers mean? Like, how did they get to these crazy values that don't seem to reflect what we do in casework? And so, yes. And so, so I realized that I'd been teaching that in my department with my folks for a really long time. And luckily I had a lot of really brilliant people that worked for me at Las Vegas. And so we had lots of discussions, and I was sitting on working groups and we were having lots of discussions. And so I was finding ways to sort of take the research that's a little difficult sometimes to digest and sort of break it down in a way that examiners can more quickly recall and sort of understand from a broad concept perspective, rather than necessarily getting tied up in all the details. And because people will remember the broad concepts and then make them practice it. So that's the essentials class. So the essentials class is really a testimony class. And what was fun is I would break the class into teams, and everyone had to come up with their own questions and answers regarding specific topics. So we did block instruction each day on very targeted topics, which then they had to come up with the questions and answers. And I would actually read off to them their questions, and they would have to answer them, and they could read their answers, but they had to hear themselves say it out loud. And then each team would go through for each block of instruction to do that. And so they heard it from me. They heard each other, and we actually followed in that class. They actually got to watch me testify, because I have my video from a homicide, a death penalty case that I testified on here in Las Vegas just in 2017, I think it was. And all the Daubert stuff came up. All of it. So I had to testify about error rates and the Mayfield case and the PCAST report and the AAAFS document, like everything, the whole kitchen sink was thrown at us in that case. And it was one bloody latent on the floor. It was the only latent evidence. There was tons of DNA evidence, gobs of DNA evidence, but the latent evidence was pretty, just the one print. So as the manager, I sort of did the early testimony for all the evidentiary parts of it. So there was like the Alice as instructor, which is obviously a lot more casual and kind of, silly. And then they got to see me in court, which was like the serious Alice. And so it was like two different people, but they actually got to see me screw up on the stand a little bit and hem and haw a little bit and get defensive. And, you could I was making faces because the defense attorney was driving me crazy. So it was kind of interesting for them to actually kind of like each day they got to see a half hour of my testimony, and I was covering in court live, basically the same issues that I was having them practice with me throughout the week. So that class was actually really doing very well I had several of them scheduled again right before the COVID thing hit. So I'd really just started that class maybe 2 years before COVID hit.
Let me ask you about the power palm prints.
Yeah.
I'm curious in that, because I was involved in the David Cam case on the last trial, and there's a couple of crime scene photos where there's this print on the side of this Bronco, and it's just like, and I believe it was Charles Bonnet, the guy who's in prison now. But what's different about palm prints and finger prints? What's the main difference there?
So it's the landscape. Palms are huge. So when you have a whole hand, then you're like, oh, totally, it's a left palm, easy breezy, or you can actually distinguish the region that you're in. But when you have a small palm print, it's very easy to get lost in the landscape. And palms have unexpected patterns. So you have to train people to build mental models of each sub-region. And then you have the whole left-right dyslexia thing that happens with palm prints as well, because they're mirror image of each other. And so it's really about targeting and understanding the distribution of the patterns, because the patterns in the fingers are at a very different distribution than the patterns in the palms. So for instance, you have like 30% of fingers will have a whorl, but only less than 3% of palms. So when you're weighting the rarity of things, even like pattern type, the palms are very, very different, and those are very different from feet. And a lot of people mistake feet for palms. So I did a study. What had happened, the whole reason the class happened is I was asked to write a paper for an encyclopedia on palm prints. And so I was going to summarize the available published literature on palm prints for the Encyclopedia of Forensic Science. And when I went looking, I couldn't really find anything in English. So I was like, wow, everything's from like the 30s and 40s. And the most recent stuff is in German, and it's a fantastic book, but I can only look at the pictures and look at the percentages. So I realized I really didn't have a deep well to get into, and that kind of frustrated me. So what I did is I just did my own. So me and two of my colleagues at Las Vegas, we spent, I don't know, a good 6 months or so going through 800 pairs of palm prints. So we had 1,600 palms, and we did full classification of every zone. And so what's kind of funny is the encyclopedia freaked out a little bit because I wasn't supposed to be publishing original research in it. I was supposed to be summarizing, but that wasn't good enough for me. So luckily Glenn kind of pushed it through.
All right.
So then I kind of realized I had actually learned some things about palm prints, because when you look at 1,600 of them, stuff starts to stick out to you, that I never knew. That was never taught to me, that I never knew. I didn't know it was a thing. And so I realized, even though there was other classes out there, I was like, I'm going to just approach this from a different perspective. And so then that kind of morphed into the palm print class that's out there now. But palms are just hard, and people usually don't get nearly as much training in palms that they do fingers. And minutia combinations and the frequency of various minutia combinations in palms is very different than, so it's the distributional information. So we learn the distribution of features in fingers really well because we look at lots of fingers, but we don't learn it as well with palms, and probably not at all with feet. Right. Because the distribution of features is different. And Heidi Eldridge with RTI did a study on palm prints, and it should be published this year. And the error rate was much higher looking at palm prints than it was for the work done looking at fingerprints. And so what we're seeing is that the performance degradation of examiners as a group is actually quite reflective of the amount of time, and even palm databases are much smaller. So a lot of AAFS technology companies weren't even able to really store palms until probably 2008, 9, 10, somewhere around then is when the palm databases, and many people didn't get them till much later. And while you can do inked print to ink print 10 print searches, doing a full ink, it doesn't do palm to palm searches. You can do a latent palm search, but it's not really designed for a palm to palm search because it's not attached to your criminal history, whereas 10 print records are attached to your criminal history. So there's just not the same infrastructure there. And in some cases, the AAFS systems, the biometric companies, aren't even using the same algorithm processes. So they might have enhanced algorithms that they use on fingers because they have such a long history using them for fingers, but they don't actually necessarily use those same enhanced algorithms for palm.
Right.
So we just, and then feet, who knows, right? So I think there's just like a whole Pandora's box rabbit hole. There's a really giant rabbit hole for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another
thing.
Let me ask you another question. We're getting on in time here, but I have a question. What kinds of things are you working on now, or what's on the road ahead for you in terms of research or publication, or just what's next for you?
So I have lots of requests to write a book. So I've been thinking about that for quite some time.
COVID is a good time to do that.
Yeah, except I'm kind of busy right now, but yeah, I'm always busy. Yeah. So I keep trying to tell my husband that I need to take a sabbatical, like southern Portugal, maybe on an island off the coast of Portugal. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
I was there last summer, by the way.
Oh, I've never been. Oh, something my to-do thing. I bet it was. Was it amazing?
It was great. It was fantastic. It's a great place to go. Great place.
I heard a lot of people are starting to retire there. So it's funny. Like, I know that our phones are listening to us because like we talk about Portugal and then all of a sudden like all the news
you get the ads
how to retire in Portugal. I'm like, they're listening to us. And a colleague of mine, we're actually discussing that a little bit. So we're kind of batting around the idea. So we have like lots of ideas, and I've had that idea for so long. I just like every time I think about it, I kind of want to throw up. So there's that. I'm announcing some new classes this year. So content development, as I'm sure you're aware, is a big, heavy lift. Mm-hmm. So what I generally find, especially for webinars, teaching in webinars is such a different environment, and it's totally changed me as an instructor. But I've learned that like for every hour of content that people see in a webinar, it's like 8 hours of work, getting it all together to flow and everything else. So I do have some new webinars that are coming out this year, starting in the last half of the year. And some of them are multi-day. So my Palm webinar is a multi-day webinar. It's like the Power Palm print class, but then condensed into a webinar form. And so I have that one that's a multi-day one that actually goes quite smoothly. Okay. And so I'm going to attempt that with some other formats from classes that I used to teach in person that now have been fragmented out. So I'm like judging suitability on a latent print. Like that's a really tough thing to do over online, but I think I'm gonna give it a go and see how that works out. Right. And then also comparative dermatoglyphics. And so what that's going to focus on is how to tell a finger from a palm from a foot. So it's more of that kind of like analysis stage stuff. So I sort of need to let those finish simmering in the pot, so to speak. And I push them out a little bit on my schedule because I have just like a skeleton right now. So it's going to take me quite a bit of time to get that fleshed out. I have some other projects that I'm working on for other people. I have picked up a couple cases along the way, so that's kind of been interesting. People just sort of find me, so that's kind of fun. Yeah. So definitely plenty. I'm just got onto so I'm on the OSAC group as an affiliate member, and I was a full member, but my life is so crazy with teaching, I can't make the meetings most of the time. So I stepped down to be an affiliate. So I just kind of help in the background with writing stuff. And then of all things, the ASB Footwear Tire Track Committee asked me to join. So I have a little background just because I did crime scene work. And then when I was a manager, I did have someone who did footwear working for me. So I'm sort of generally familiar, but I'm sort of being brought into the ASB as sort of an outsider on purpose to bring sort of some of the lessons learned by fingerprint community into that discipline and just sort of, talk about those issues. So that's a heavy lift for me simply because I don't like feeling like I don't know enough. So what'll happen is before the meetings, I spend many hours like reading and tearing into everything I can find to sort of prepare me for those conversations. So between all of that, this year's pretty busy with that. And Glenn, who also teaches with me through the webinars that we do, we have also decided to continue into next year. So we're fleshing out our schedule for this year, and we will probably, well, we already discussed it, but we will continue on after that. So I have to kind of think about the transition back to in-person training. So like, how do I, do my schedule? So we have an RV that we travel in usually around the country. So that's like loads of fun. We did that for a whole year before the COVID thing hit. And we drove everywhere. We put 22,000 miles through Canada, through North America, 22,000 miles on the RV. And it was like insane. And glad we're not in it right now. So, so there's these elements of life that I sort of want to, kind of piecemeal together. So I have to think about what that's scheduling. I got a lot of things. So,
well, that's obvious. There's you won't be criticized for being a person that's looking for things.
I got a lot of stuff ticking around up here. And I got lots of ideas and they haven't all come to fruition yet.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, maybe one time in the future, you might be able to help me to get Glenn on at some point in the future or whatever. And,
for sure.
Yeah. He is. I told you, I think I met him at a conference once, and this is like 10 years later, and I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure I met him. You know what I mean? Just for a brief moment, but
he's another one that gets his hands in all kinds of stuff. So for sure,
I'm sure.
That would be great.
Well, look, I want to say thank you so much for everything and for making this so easy for me. I could just let you go. You've got a ton of stuff, a ton of work, a ton of background, great experiences and everything else. And I'd like to have you on maybe at some point in the future, maybe do something more specific or whatever. But I think it's fantastic what you're doing. Great job on all the, it just seems really novel and really interesting what you're doing. And I might have to kick a few ideas around with you at some point too.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Hey, hang back for a sec. I'm just going to close that very quickly.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Portugal. All right. All right. See ya. All right, everyone. Well, that does it. What a great conversation. Lots of great information there. Next week, I'm going to be having Barry Fisher. A lot of you know Barry. He's online. He's had a ton of history in forensic science, and he's going to be talking about ethics in forensic science. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, make sure you pop on. I'll be posting it online, and you'll be hearing much more about it as probably later today or tomorrow. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Take care. Bye-bye.